An American judge thought she had seen it all, until one case challenged everything she believed in. What unfolded in her courtroom didn't just change a verdict, it changed her life. This is the powerful story behind her unexpected journey to Islam. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany paneling of Judge Margaret Chen's courtroom as she reviewed the day's docket. At 52 years old, she had presided over countless cases during her 15-year tenure on the bench, earning a reputation for fairness and intellectual rigor. Her Presbyterian upbringing in suburban Chicago had instilled in her a strong moral compass, one that guided her through the complexities of the American legal system. Margaret's path to the judiciary had been unconventional. After earning her law degree from Northwestern, she had spent a decade as a public defender, fighting for those who couldn't afford representation. The work had been exhausting but meaningful, and it had shaped her understanding of justice as something more nuanced than simple punishment. When Governor Patterson appointed her to the bench, she brought with her a deep empathy for the human stories behind every case. Her courtroom reflected her personality, orderly but warm, with photographs of her late husband David and their adopted daughter Sarah prominently displayed on her desk. David had passed away 3 years earlier from cancer, leaving Margaret to navigate both grief and single parenthood while maintaining her demanding judicial schedule. Faith had been her anchor during those dark months, though she sometimes questioned whether her prayers reached anyone at all. The case that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late October. The defendant, Omar Hassan, sat quietly beside his public defender, his hands folded in his lap. The charges were serious: armed robbery of a convenience store that had netted him barely $200 and a pack of cigarettes. The store owner, Mrs. Patterson, was an elderly widow who had been working the night shift to make ends meet. The gun Omar had brandished turned out to be a replica, but the terror in Mrs. Patterson's eyes had been real enough. As Margaret reviewed the file, she noted the defendant's background. 34 years old, father of 3, recently laid off from his job at the automotive plant. His wife had been battling cancer, and their insurance had lapsed with his employment. The medical bills were mounting, and desperate times had led to desperate measures. It was a story Margaret had heard variations of countless times, but something about this case felt different. Omar's attorney, a young woman named Lisa Rodriguez, stood to address the court. She painted a picture of a man driven to desperation by circumstances beyond his control. A devoted husband and father who had never been in trouble with the law before that night. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney James Mitchell, countered with the victim's trauma and the need for accountability regardless of motivation. Margaret listened to both sides with her usual attention to detail, but her focus kept returning to Omar himself. Unlike many defendants who appeared before her, he never looked away when she addressed him directly. His eyes held a mixture of shame and resignation that spoke of a man who understood the gravity of his actions. When she asked him to speak on his own behalf, his words were measured and sincere. "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong. There's no excuse for frightening Mrs. Patterson or for breaking the law. I was scared about my wife, about my children, about losing everything we'd worked for. But that doesn't make it right. I accept responsibility for my actions, and I'm prepared to face the consequences." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but it was what happened next that truly caught Margaret's attention. Mrs. Patterson, the victim, rose from her seat in the gallery. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Margaret nodded, curious about what the elderly woman might contribute to the proceedings. Mrs. Patterson looked directly at Omar, her voice steady despite her age. "Mr. Hassan, what you did scared me terribly. I haven't been able to work nights since it happened, but I've been thinking about your situation, about your wife and children. I know what it's like to be desperate, to feel like you have no options left." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I don't want to see you go to prison. Your family needs you, and prison won't help anyone. I'd rather see you get help, maybe do some community service, and find a way to make things right without destroying your future." The courtroom fell silent. Margaret had seen victims advocate for leniency before, but something about Mrs. Patterson's words resonated beyond the usual calls for mercy. There was a depth to her forgiveness that seemed to come from a place of genuine understanding rather than mere sympathy. After the hearing, Margaret found herself thinking about the case long into the evening. She had sentenced Omar to probation with community service and mandated counseling, but the interaction between victim and perpetrator had left her unsettled in ways she couldn't articulate. The next morning, she made an unusual decision. She would visit Mrs. Patterson to better understand her perspective. Margaret found the elderly woman at her modest apartment, tending to a small garden on her balcony. Mrs. Patterson welcomed her warmly, inviting her in for tea and cookies that reminded Margaret of her grandmother's kitchen. "I hope you don't mind me asking," Margaret began, "but yesterday in court, your response to Mr. Hassan was remarkable. Where did that compassion come from?" Mrs. Patterson smiled, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. "Judge Chen, I'm a Muslim. Have been for 30 years now. I converted when I married my late husband. Allah rest his soul. One of the things Islam taught me is that mercy and justice aren't opposites, they're partners. The Quran tells us that Allah is both just and merciful, and we're called to reflect those qualities in our own lives." Margaret listened intently as Mrs. Patterson continued. "When I looked at that young man, I didn't just see someone who had hurt me. I saw a father facing impossible choices, a husband watching his wife suffer, a human being who had lost his way. My faith teaches me that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, and that forgiveness often serves justice better than punishment alone." The conversation continued for hours, ranging from Islamic teachings about social justice to the practical applications of mercy in daily life. Mrs. Patterson shared stories from her own journey of faith, the struggles she had faced as a convert, and the peace she had found in Islam's emphasis on community and mutual support. As Margaret drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about concepts she had never seriously considered before. Her own faith had always been more cultural than deeply spiritual, a set of traditions and moral guidelines, rather than a transformative force. But there was something in Mrs. Patterson's description of Islam that resonated with her own sense of justice and compassion. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself returning to the elderly woman's apartment for more conversations. Mrs. Patterson introduced her to other members of the local Muslim community, including Imam Abdullah, a soft-spoken scholar who had been leading the mosque for over a decade. These new acquaintances challenged Margaret's preconceptions about Islam, showing her a faith community that was diverse, intellectually rigorous, and deeply committed to social justice. The more Margaret learned, the more she found herself drawn to Islam's comprehensive approach to life. Unlike her childhood Christianity, which had often felt compartmentalized, Sunday worship separate from weekday living, Islam seemed to offer a framework that integrated spiritual, social, and moral dimensions into a coherent whole. The concept of divine justice tempered by infinite mercy particularly appealed to her judicial sensibilities. Imam Abdullah lent her books and recommended online lectures, and Margaret began to study with the same intellectual rigor she had once applied to legal briefs. She learned about the 5 pillars, the importance of community in Islamic practice, and the faith's emphasis on caring for the poor and marginalized. The more she studied, the more she felt a spiritual hunger she hadn't realized existed. The turning point came during a conversation with her daughter Sarah, now a college sophomore studying social work. Margaret had been struggling with whether to share her spiritual journey with her only child, fearing judgment or disappointment. "Mom, you've seemed different lately," Sarah observed during one of their weekly phone calls. "Happier somehow. More at peace than you've been since Dad died." Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain her journey, her encounters with Mrs. Patterson in the Muslim community, and her growing attraction to Islamic teachings. She braced herself for pushback or concern, but Sarah's response surprised her. "Mom, if this brings you peace and makes you a better person, then I support you completely. I've always admired your sense of justice, and if Islam helps you express that more fully, then maybe it's exactly what you need." That evening, Margaret called Imam Abdullah and asked if she could meet with him privately. 3 days later, sitting in his study surrounded by books in Arabic and English, she spoke the words that would change her life forever. "I want to become a Muslim." The Imam smiled gently. "Sister Margaret, are you certain this is what your heart desires? Conversion is not a decision to be made lightly." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm coming home to something I didn't know I was looking for." With Imam Abdullah as her witness, Margaret recited the Shahada, the declaration of faith that officially marked her entry into Islam. The words felt natural on her tongue, as if she had been preparing to say them her entire life. At that moment, she chose to take the Islamic name Maryam, honoring both the Virgin Mary of her Christian upbringing and the revered mother of Jesus in Islamic tradition. The weeks following Maryam's conversion were a whirlwind of learning and adjustment. She began attending daily prayers at the mosque, finding solace in the rhythmic movements and communal devotion. The Muslim community welcomed her with open arms, providing guidance on everything from dietary laws to proper prayer techniques. Mrs. Patterson, in particular, became a mentor and friend, helping Maryam navigate the practical aspects of living as a new Muslim in America. However, the transition wasn't without challenges. When news of her conversion inevitably became public, Maryam faced scrutiny from multiple directions. Some colleagues questioned whether her new faith would compromise her ability to render impartial judgments, while certain members of the community wondered about her motivations. The local newspaper ran a story about the judge who found Allah, treating her spiritual journey as a curiosity rather than a deeply personal transformation. The professional challenges were perhaps the most difficult to navigate. During a particularly contentious custody case, the attorney for one party suggested that Judge Chen's newfound religious extremism made her unfit to decide matters involving Christian families. Maryam handled the objection with her characteristic grace, explaining that her personal faith enhanced rather than compromised her commitment to equal justice under law. "My duty as a judge is to apply the law fairly and impartially," she stated from the bench. "My faith teaches me to be just and merciful, qualities that serve the cause of justice rather than undermining it. Any suggestion that my religious beliefs disqualify me from performing my judicial duties is both legally baseless and personally offensive." The incident was reported in legal journals, sparking broader discussions about religious diversity in the judiciary. Several Muslim legal organizations reached out to offer support, while constitutional law scholars defended her right to practice her faith while serving in public office. The controversy gradually subsided, but it reinforced Maryam's understanding that her journey would continue to face public scrutiny. More personally challenging was the response from some members of her extended family. Her sister Rebecca, a devout Presbyterian, struggled to understand Maryam's decision, fearing that their mother was losing her way. Their conversations became tense, with Rebecca questioning whether Islam was compatible with American values and whether Maryam was being manipulated by extremist influences. "Becky, I'm the same person I've always been," Maryam explained during one particularly difficult phone call. "I believe in the same principles of justice, compassion, and service that Mom and Dad taught us. Islam just gives me a framework for living those principles more fully." But what about Jesus? What about everything we were raised to believe? Islam honors Jesus as one of the great prophets. I haven't rejected my upbringing. I've found a faith that builds on it while providing answers to questions I've carried for years." The conversation ended in tears, but over time, Rebecca began to see the positive changes in her sister. Miriam seemed more centered, more purposeful, and more at peace with herself than she had been in years. The anger and bitterness that had consumed her after David's death had been replaced by a quiet confidence and genuine serenity. 6 months after her conversion, Miriam faced her first major test as a Muslim judge. A hate crime case came before her court. A young Muslim woman had been attacked while walking home from the mosque, her hijab torn off by assailants who called her a terrorist. The defendants were 2 local men with histories of alcohol abuse and previous assault charges. As Miriam presided over the case, she was acutely aware of the scrutiny she faced from both sides. The Muslim community looked to her for justice, while critics watched for any sign of bias or favoritism. The defendant's attorney even filed a motion requesting her recusal, arguing that her religious conversion created an inherent conflict of interest. Miriam denied the motion, explaining that her duty was to apply the law regardless of the religious identity of the parties involved. Justice is not achieved by having only Christian judges hear cases involving Christian victims, or Jewish judges hear cases involving Jewish victims. My obligation is to ensure that all parties receive fair treatment under the law, regardless of their faith or mine. The trial proceeded with Miriam's characteristic attention to detail and fairness. She carefully instructed the jury on hate crime statutes while ensuring that the defendants received vigorous representation. When the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts, she imposed sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the defendants' potential for rehabilitation. In her sentencing remarks, Miriam addressed the broader implications of the case. Hate crimes don't just harm individual victims, they attack the very foundations of our diverse society. When we target people because of their religion, race, or ethnicity, we undermine the principles of equality and mutual respect that make our community strong. The Muslim community praised her handling of the case, while legal observers noted that her sentences were entirely within established guidelines and precedent. The controversy that some had predicted never materialized, and Miriam's reputation for fairness remained intact. As her first year as a Muslim drew to a close, Miriam reflected on how profoundly her life had changed. Her daily prayers provided structure and meaning that had been missing since David's death. The Muslim community had become an extended family, offering support and friendship that enriched her life immeasurably. Her relationship with Sarah had deepened as they explored questions of faith and purpose together. Most importantly, her work as a judge had taken on new dimensions of meaning. She found herself more attuned to the human stories behind each case, more creative in seeking solutions that served both justice and mercy. Her study of Islamic jurisprudence had introduced her to concepts of restorative justice that complemented her existing legal training. The transformation wasn't without ongoing challenges. She still faced occasional skepticism from colleagues and criticism from those who questioned her motivations or competence. The media attention had largely subsided, but she remained aware that her actions were often scrutinized more closely than those of her peers. On a quiet Friday evening, exactly 1 year after her conversion, Miriam sat in her study, surrounded by both legal books and Islamic texts. The Quran lay open beside a stack of case files, symbolizing the integration of faith and profession that had become the hallmark of her new life. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from the courtroom encounter with Omar Hassan and Mrs. Patterson, to her first tentative conversations about Islam, to the moment she spoke the Shahada in Imam Abdullah's office. The phone rang, interrupting her reflections. It was Mrs. Patterson calling with news that Omar Hassan had successfully completed his community service and was starting a new job with a local nonprofit organization. His wife's cancer was in remission, and the family was slowly rebuilding their lives. Judge Chen, Sister Miriam, I wanted to thank you again for how you handled Omar's case. Your decision to show mercy while maintaining justice changed his life. He asks about you often and wants you to know that he's grateful every day for the second chance you gave him. After hanging up, Miriam returned to her books with renewed purpose. The case that had begun her spiritual journey continued to bear fruit, creating ripples of positive change that extended far beyond that October morning in her courtroom. She understood now that her conversion to Islam wasn't an ending, but a beginning, the start of a journey toward a more integrated life where faith and service, justice and mercy, personal conviction and public duty could coexist in harmony. As she prepared for evening prayers, Miriam felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led her to Islam. The faith had given her not just a new relationship with the divine, but a renewed sense of purpose in her work and relationships. She had found in Islam not an escape from her responsibilities, but a framework for fulfilling them more completely. The muezzin's call to prayer echoed from the nearby mosque, calling the faithful to gather in worship. Miriam closed her books, performed her ablutions, and prepared to join her community in prayer. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve justice with mercy. She faced the future with the confidence that comes from knowing one's path is guided by something greater than personal ambition or professional obligation. In choosing Islam, Judge Margaret Chen had not only found a new faith, she had discovered a new way of being in the world, one that honored both the law she had sworn to uphold and the deeper calling of her heart. Her journey from skeptical jurist to committed Muslim had transformed not just her own life, but had created possibilities for understanding and reconciliation that extended far beyond the walls of her courtroom.